Welcome back. So glad you're still with us. Now, where we left off is we have made our preset buttons, which are an array of controls. We have written func interlock. We have done step 2, which is we have prepared the string to send. We're now ready for step 3, which is to send the command string. So all we need to do from here is take that string that we built and send it to the lights.
And this part, I can probably take off your hands and do it myself, because
All right.
having done the intermediate class with the block controller, I know how easy this is. You can just go to where your text controller is for your lighting design, and then add a TCP connection right down at the wah.
Yeah.
Where is it?
Guess what? The text controller doesn't give you that option. You are actually going to have to make your own connection. So what Nate's talking about is if you were in the block controller, at the bottom, there was a place to where you could add a TCP connection. And if you happen to open the block controller and look under the hood, you would have seen that it added like 150 lines of code to make all of that happen.
So we're about to write 150 lines of code ourselves.
Actually, we're not going to write 150 lines of code. The block controller, as you may remember, is really, really good about putting safety rails on your code. We're going to write code, and it's going to be fine. Look at that. We have some Pringles. So what we are going to have to do is we are going to have to establish our own connection. Here's how we're going to do it. There is another extension into Lua that Q-SYS provides. We have the TCP socket library, which comes with a number of different things. The TCP socket library, first and foremost, we're able to instantiate a new TCP socket by using the .new function. We're going to do it in a minute, okay? But let's chat for a second. As we think about TCP sockets, there are a number of attributes to a TCP socket. We'll get to that in a minute. But there's also a number of things that a TCP socket can do, i.e. built-in functions of a TCP socket. And we call them methods. In fact, you've seen methods before because we talked about the method of a trigger button is to use the :trigger. We also are going to use methods here with the TCP socket. In fact, here are 6 methods. And if you're a little thrown off by the vocabulary, a really helpful way of thinking about it is like this. One, we recognize them by the fact that they use colons. And what they are is effectively built-in functions of the thing that you have instantiated. So when we used a trigger button, we used the :trigger method to activate it. Our TCP socket actually has 6 methods. We recognize them by the colons here. And if you stop and think about it for a minute, there are actually 6 things a TCP socket ought to be able to do. It ought to be able to connect. It ought to be able to disconnect, right? It ought to be able to pick up the phone. It ought to be able to hang up the phone. It ought to be able to write data. It ought to be able to read data. And you might notice there's actually 2 here that's related. One is read, the other is read line. They both take arguments, and it comes down to how are we doing communication. We are going to make use of the read line because we're going to stick in that end of line character that we're looking for, because our method of communication over TCP is very much like the old serial port style of communicating. It's very popular. It's been around for a long time. And it's the method where we talk and use a talking stick to say we're done. And then it talks back to us and uses a talking stick to say that it's done. Right? This is a very established way of doing things. And then lastly, you are able to search inside of your buffer. Now, before we move on, I actually want to call attention to the arguments of the connect method. Nate, what is the first thing that you notice about the connect method's arguments?
Well, it's got two arguments. One of them is a string, and one of them is probably a number because it doesn't have quotes around it, right?
That's right. That's right. How did you know that IP address was a string?
Well, we got those quotes on both sides, turns it into a string,
Right.
And that makes sense because otherwise, if you put it as a number, it would think that it's like a number with a decimal point, and then more numbers, and then another decimal point, and then more numbers, and that's not a number. That's not how numbers work.
Right. That is a weird number.
Yeah.
Which you may recall we had a slide and it said malformed number. It's totally weird. All right. Any other reason why it might be a string?
Nothing I can think of. What do you got
So, very quickly, my mother, right, Mima, she's 80. She turned 80 last week.
for me? We've already established I've gone back in time and married her. You can just call her my wife. Go on.
No. Mima is on Facebook all the time. Now, Mima doesn't know anything about IP addresses and octets and any of that stuff, but she definitely knows how to get onto the Facebook and do all of the Facebook things that 80-year-olds do. Now, how is it that she's able to get onto the Facebook without knowing IP addresses, Nate?
She probably has a wonderful son who's explained it to her.
I just...
Or, as I prefer to call you, my son-in-law.
Wow. Okay. It's getting weird in here. The answer is, of course, host names. You totally can use host names as well. So she's able to get to Facebook because she uses DNS. You can do the same thing. Maybe DNS is set up on your network, but certainly our TCP socket is able to use IP address octets. It's able to use host names. It's fine. It works. That's why it's a string. That actually is going to become really important in a little bit. For our end of line arguments that we talked about, there are actually several different options that you could have chosen from. And you can hit pause. You can read the slide here. This is all fine. There are several options to choose from. But for me, and what I'm going to model for you is by the time we get ready to push code into production, we are going to know the answer to what is the end of line character. We're not going to rely on guessing. If you're having trouble connecting and communicating with a device, try some of the rest of these. But we're gonna take the pathway of we're gonna start with what does the API say, and we're gonna experiment and make sure that what the API said was accurate. I personally, I'm going to use .custom and make sure I'm putting in exactly what the end of line is because we will have done the development and we will know what the correct answer is. I don't need to guess. So let's talk about the properties of a TCP socket. So the methods are what it can do. The properties are things that are true about it. Well, one of the things about a TCP socket is things happen to it. It has an event handler. And there are several things that can happen, but we're going to save that slide for a moment. The rest of the properties that are relevant to us, if you want to make use of them, it's good that you know about them. You can set read timeouts. You can set write timeouts. You can set a reconnect timeout. And then two of the ones that I think are most useful from time to time is the idea of it knows if it is connected or not. I think that's really great because in the old days, I used to open sockets and then would have to raise a flag in my code to keep track of whether I'm connected or not. Here, we can just ask the TCP socket, are you connected or not? And it knows. And then .buffer length. Now, you might remember that we were talking about the difference between read and read line. In the read method, you have to give it an argument of how much data do you want to read out of the buffer. The .buffer length is actually usually the right answer if you are doing those advanced kinds of communications. Basically, a big inrush of data comes in, and then you extract all of it out and you start parsing it.
It's kind of like going to Taco Bell and saying, I want a taco. and they say, how many tacos do you want? And I say, well, how many tacos do you have? Because that's the answer, how many tacos I want, right?
Yeah, so dot buffer length is really useful from that point of view. One last thing, and we're going to cover it quickly because in this first part of dealing with the lights, we are just going to start talking to the lights. Later, when we're ready to hear back, we'll revisit this slide, but I'm going to show it to you now. These are the callbacks of the event handler. So if we saw that there were 6 things that a TCP socket could do, here are the 6 things that could happen to a TCP socket. It can be connected. It can be reconnected. It can get data. It can get closed, meaning it could be hung up on. It could have an error. It could get timed out. These are the 6 things that could happen to a TCP socket. So we've seen methods. Those are the colons. That's what it can do. We've seen the rest of the dots. That's the properties, things that are true about it. And then there are the event handler events. These are the things that could happen to it. Now, for us, we're actually ready to apply some of this information. And we are going to start with the modest goal of simply making the lights turn on.